Hi, I'm Moji Alawodeyal from the Feminist Buzzkills Live Pod, the only podcast that helps you navigate the news in this post-Roe anti-abortion hellscape. Each week, with co-host Liz Winstead, we dissect all the news from that sketchy intersection of abortion and misogyny with providers and activists working on the ground. The cherry on top is we have amazing comedy guests who help us laugh through the rage. Feminist Buzzkills Live drops Fridays wherever you pod. Listen and subscribe, because when BS is popping, we pop off.
Care Talk with Laura Packard is a podcast covering healthcare in America from a progressive perspective. Our healthcare system is broken, and we all know insurance companies are out of control. If you don't have health insurance or don't understand the differences between insurance plans, or have surprise medical bills, out of control prescription drug costs, or can't get the care you need, listen to Care Talk with Laura Packard weekly on Tuesdays. What's going to happen to your healthcare under the Trump administration? From prescription drug prices to health insurance costs, from healthcare for seniors and people with disabilities to reproductive care, from care for veterans to public health, including vaccinations. Healthcare experts answer your questions every week, and they go in-depth on Medicare, Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act, private insurance, and more. Go to healthcarevoices.org/caretalk or search for Care Talk with Laura Packard on your favorite podcast app to listen today.
Our press secretary gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to UnSpun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hello, truth seekers, and welcome to this week's Unspun. You've probably heard it before. A politician steps up to the microphone and makes a promise. Law and order. Now, some people who hear this feel relief, right? The idea that someone's finally going to restore peace. But other people are going to hear something darker. Control or repression, even punishment. That phrase, just those three little words, carries a lot of weight. And it's nothing new. For centuries, politicians have reached for law and order in times of upheaval. Sometimes they mean it literally, enforcing laws so society doesn't collapse into chaos. But often it's been something else, a coded call to resist change. It's a way to draw lines about who belongs and who doesn't, and in some cases it's been a tool for leaders to expand their own power. Today, I want to show you how this phrase has been used and what it can mean when we hear it now. To get there, we'll start by listening to three very different voices from three very different eras. First, we'll hear George Wallace. Wallace was the governor of Alabama in the 1960s, and he's remembered mostly for his hardline defense of segregation. In 1963, he stood on the steps of the University of Alabama to block 2 black students from entering. That same year, he delivered a speech that made his position unmistakable. Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Wallace wrapped himself in the promise of law and order, but he used it to rally white voters who were angry about desegregation and civil rights protests. So here's George Wallace.
Law and order is still an issue in this country. 127 policemen were killed last year, the largest number killed in any year of our history. There is a conspiracy to assassinate law enforcement personnel in this country. In the city of Washington, our nation's capital, you cannot walk the streets safely or get in an elevator safely or walk anywhere in that particular city. This is a sad commentary on the most supposedly civilized country's capital in the world. And yet those who are running for the presidency from the Senate down in Florida have been there a great number of years. Now they talk about law and order. Why didn't they do something about law and order during these last number of years when your capital became so unsafe?
You can hear the uncertainty in his voice. For Wallace, law and order wasn't about neutral enforcement of laws. It was about defending a particular social order, one built on racial hierarchy. Now we'll jump ahead a half a century and cross the Atlantic. This next voice is Nigel Farage. He's a British politician, probably best known for leading the UK Independence Party and for championing Brexit. Farage has built his career on fiery speeches warning that immigration was undermining Britain's way of life. He often invoked law and order in that context, framing immigrants and refugees as sources of crime and instability. So here's Nigel Farage.
The cases, we've just accepted that shoplifting is okay. Drugs being smoked openly on the streets, that apparently is just okay. So what we've done is we've raised the level of what we now deem to be acceptable behaviour. And of course what happens if you go lax on it? Well, of course, crime moves up to fill that gap and then moves on further still. So I want to be absolutely clear at the start of this 6-week campaign that Reform will be the toughest party on law and order and on crime that this country has ever seen.
It's a different accent, it's a different country, but if you listen carefully, the logic is the same. Law and order becomes shorthand for controlling outsiders, for keeping a national identity intact by force. And finally, here's a voice much closer to home, Donald Trump.
Americans want law and order. They demand law and order. They may not say it, they may not be talking about it, but that's what they want. Some of them don't even know that's what they want, but that's what they want. And they understand that when you remove the police, you hurt those who have the least the most.
During his presidency, and even after the first one, Trump has repeatedly branded himself as the candidate of law and order. He's used it in response to protests, especially those led by Black activists. He's painted American cities as crime-ridden and out of control. In 2020, he deployed federal agents to places like Portland, saying local leaders had lost control and only he could restore order. So here's Donald Trump. And of course, today, the idea of law and order is being used to deploy the military in cities like Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. And again, law and order is not a neutral phrase, it's a political one. It's setting up a contrast between real Americans and those who get portrayed as dangerous or disruptive or disloyal. And it's used to justify stronger action from the state. So we've got 3 voices and 3 contexts. But there's one through line. Law and order is never just about laws, and it's never just about order. It's about power. Who has the power? Who keeps the power? And that's where we're headed today. First, we'll trace the history of law and order from its origins centuries ago to the way it entered American politics in the 19th century. And we'll see how it's been used to resist change and to protect privilege. And then we're going to look at the mid-20th century, when law and order became tied to racial politics in the United States. And third, we're going to widen the lens, looking at leaders from around the world, from Turkey to Canada to China, who have invoked law and order in moments of crisis. That rhetoric often walks hand in hand with authoritarianism. And finally, we'll reflect on why this phrase still matters, what it should signal to us when we hear it today. Because here's the bottom line. Law and order can sound comforting, but history shows us it's rarely neutral. When a newsmaker promises law and order, do we recognize what's really being promised? That's what we're getting into today. Sound good? Let's get unspun. If you hear the phrase law and order today, you might think of campaign speeches, protest crackdowns, maybe even the TV show by that name. But those words have gone together for centuries, all the way back to the 1500s. In its early uses, it meant something straightforward, keeping the peace by making sure that laws were enforced and society didn't fall into chaos. And back then, it wasn't especially political, it was just descriptive. It was a way to talk about stability, the idea that people could live their lives without fear of violence or disorder. But in more modern times, it started to change. By the 19th century, law and order had already become a rallying cry in times of conflict, and it was almost always as a way to resist social change. An early example comes from Rhode Island in the 1830s and 40s. At that time, there was a growing movement to expand the right to vote. And some reformers wanted suffrage to include all white men, not just white male property owners. And you have to understand, at the time, this was pretty radical. A group calling themselves the Law and Order Party formed in opposition. And they argued that keeping political power tied to property ownership was essential for stability. To them, expanding suffrage looked like chaos. so they cast their resistance as a defense of law and order. The very name of that party tells us something important. They weren't primarily arguing about crime rates or public safety. They were arguing about who counted, who got to participate in democracy. Law and order was the frame for keeping that circle small. And it shows up again and again. Decades later in Kansas, there were these fierce debates over whether Kansas would enter the Union as a free state or a slave state. And a group of pro-slavery folks branded themselves as the Law and Order Party. Their argument was that enslavement was not only legitimate but ordained by God. And this meant that those who resisted it were the ones threatening peace and stability. So I want you to think about that for a second. The law that they wanted to uphold was the legal right to own other human beings. And the order was the hierarchy that placed white enslavers on the top. So law and order wasn't neutral, it was the language of power. And by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that phrase shows up again, this time tied to a different kind of social upheaval, immigration and prohibition. The temperance movement, which tried to ban the sale of alcohol, often cast itself as a fight for law and order. Frances Willard was one of the most influential prohibition leaders, and she said it repeatedly. So to her, banning alcohol wasn't actually just about morality. It was about protecting the social order from what she saw as the corrupting influence of urban and immigrant culture. Let's stop and think about that for a moment. See, prohibition wasn't just a fight over liquor. It was about class and about ethnicity. The law and order side was largely Protestant, rural, and nativist, and they pictured the disorder, as symbolized by the saloon, an institution tied closely to Catholic, working-class immigrant communities. So when they cast banning drinking as supporting law and order, they weren't really just talking about alcohol. In a way, they were defining about who belonged in proper American society and who didn't. You know, even before George Wallace and the Civil Rights era, law and order was more than a phrase, it was a political weapon. It was a palatable way to fight change you didn't like. And here's what I mean by that. First, that phrase, law and order, shows up when the world feels chaotic, when people feel that their world is shifting under their feet. And second, it almost always shows up on the lips of those who are trying to slow down or reverse that change. And third, it works. I mean, what sane person would say, "Oh, I'll take the chaos, please"? Everybody values stability. And this makes it a particularly dangerous thing. Because when you attach law and order to what you prefer politically, it redefines the world. Because you're saying that what you want means peace and stability, and any opposition is an argument for chaos and disruption, and that's really powerful, especially when the real issue isn't actually crime or whatever, or about who gets rights. Because law and order carries a double meaning. It's about which laws deserve protecting and whose idea of order gets enforced. I need to take a quick break, but when I come back, we'll see how that idea has continued to be politically useful in modern times. I'll be right back. Welcome back. By the time we get to the 20th century, the phrase law and order isn't just resisting cultural change, it's become a central part of national politics, and it's tied to questions of race, questions of crime, and even to democracy itself. By the mid-20th century, law and order had shifted into a really charged political weapon. You can think about the United States in the 1960s. The country was in upheaval. Things felt really unstable. There were civil rights protests on the streets in cities, and courts were making rulings to strike down segregation. And at the same time, crime rates were going up. This was a trend that started in the 60s and continued into the 70s. And that rising crime, which had a bunch of different causes, meant that it was easy for law and order to become a central theme in American politics. It started showing up in speeches by conservative leaders like Barry Goldwater, George Wallace, and Richard Nixon. And their words promised safety and calm, but underneath it carried a different message. Resisting social change, particularly things that would give more power to more groups of people. It was a really convenient way to try to slow the advances of the civil rights movement. Take Goldwater, for example. He ran for president in 1964, and he rejected the idea of civil rights laws because he argued that if the federal government were to enforce desegregation, that was going to be government overreach. He insisted that he was caring about the constitutional principles, not about race, but he coupled his stance with calls for stronger policing and law and order. And for many white voters who were uneasy about civil rights, that message was clear. Social change was just going to bring chaos. The cure was keeping things as they were, with racial minorities being second-class citizens. George Wallace, the Alabama governor we heard earlier, went even further. He openly called federal civil rights policies threats to social stability. And he was a compelling speaker, and his fiery words made him kind of a hero to white conservatives. because for his audience, law and order meant silencing protesters and maintaining discrimination in racial hierarchy. And then there was Richard Nixon. Now, Nixon didn't shout like Wallace, but he manipulated people's uneasiness about integration for his own purposes, because he saw that after civil rights legislation was passing, white voters in the South felt abandoned by the Democratic Party. Nixon's genius was to reach them with coded language. Instead of railing against desegregation, he talked about law and order, and silent majorities, and respect for the police. He didn't have to say it, but the meaning was clear. Crime was a problem for urban areas. Disorder came from protest movements, and both of those were linked with black communities. And over time, those words became policy. Under Nixon, the federal government dramatically grew its role in law enforcement. And there was the war on drugs, there was mandatory minimum sentencing became a lot more common, and prisons grew, and by the 1980s it became more likely for a black boy in America to grow up and go to prison than to grow up and go to college. The idea of being tough on crime, with longer sentences, more police, less tolerance for dissent, it became a choice that both parties supported for decades. And here's the paradox. On paper, law and order sounds like you're defending the rule of law. What you're really doing is tilting the balance toward order at the expense of the law. Because in a healthy democracy, legal principles apply fairly to everyone, right? The idea we say is no one is above the law. But the politics of law and order reverses that logic, empowering the state to forcibly impose order, even if it's unfair to some people. And you'll start seeing things like stop and frisk policies and people getting pulled over at a much higher rate if they're black or brown. It's important to recognize how effective this was and how effective it continues to be. Scholars and journalists in the 60s and since have documented how law and order became a racially coded appeal, and it was designed to peel away white voters from a Democratic coalition while maintaining plausible deniability. And it worked. Nixon won the presidency in 1968 in part by riding that wave. Wallace got millions of votes running on a more extreme version of the same message. And, those examples show the power of law and order as a political brand. And the consequences have stuck around for us. The policies hardened a political culture where toughness, which is measured by arrests, prosecutions, and prison time, became a test of credibility. And even in a country with free speech guaranteed, it's blurred the line between protecting public safety and policing political dissent. I can just look at the news today, when the White House is posting memes about going to war with American cities, and where peaceful protesters are being arrested, and you can see the legacy of this kind of talk. It's a partisan weapon, it's a racial code, and it's a governing philosophy that justifies expanding the power of the state. We've already talked about George Wallace and Richard Nixon in some depth, and decades later, Donald Trump has picked up the same banner. During his presidency, the first time, Trump regularly declared himself the law and order candidate. He used the phrase especially during the summer of 2020, as protests against racial injustice filled American streets after the death of George Floyd. His language framed cities with large black populations or progressive leadership as crime-ridden and lawless, and he set up a contrast verbally between real Americans and supposed enemies within. And it's gone beyond rhetoric, right? In Portland, Oregon, he sent federal agents to confront protesters, sometimes against the wishes of local leaders, and the official justification was restoring order. But critics have pointed out that it looks like the federal government bypassing local authority and using force in ways that violate civil rights. You saw the same thing in Los Angeles, and you're seeing it right now in D.C. Trump is echoing that much older pattern, invoking law and order, not to preserve neutral justice, but to justify exceptional measures and stronger control from the government. I think it's useful to know, though, that tactic is not unique to the U.S. You can take Canada in 1970, for example. There was a separatist group in Quebec, the Front for Liberation of Quebec, or the FLQ, that kidnapped a British diplomat and later actually murdered a Canadian cabinet minister. And in response, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, he was the father of the recent Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, he invoked the War Measures Act, giving the national government extraordinary powers, and you saw the military patrolling Canadian cities. The government suspended civil liberties, and hundreds of people were arrested without being charged. Trudeau said his decision was needed to restore order, but critics saw that as a dangerous overreach. And half a century later, that same logic has appeared in Eastern Europe. In 2021, thousands of migrants, many from the Middle East, massed along the borders of Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania. And their governments responded with militarized force, building fences, pushing migrants back illegally, bypassing asylum laws. And they defended this as protecting law and order against chaos at the border. But democratic values maybe were being undermined in the process. And then there's Turkey. In 2016, a failed coup attempt shook the country, and the president, Erdogan, responded by declaring a state of emergency. In the months that followed, tens of thousands of people were jailed. Journalists were silenced, opposition politicians were targeted, and the constitution was rewritten to concentrate power in the presidency. This was all justified in the name of restoring order. But international observers have seen it as something different: the consolidation of authoritarian rules. And the examples keep coming. And in each of these cases, in the US and Canada and Turkey and Eastern Europe, the pattern repeats itself. There's a moment of crisis. It might be a real crisis. It might be a manufactured crisis. There's a promise of law and order, and then state power grows and civil rights diminish. Ordinary citizens, because they're worried about their safety, and perhaps rightfully so, accept those measures, even if it means giving up freedoms. But once they give those freedoms up, they rarely get them back. And so this is why scholars warn that law and order politics is a gateway to authoritarianism. It takes someone's legitimate desire for safety and security and uses it to justify repression, taking the focus away from the rule of law, where everyone is equally accountable, under fair process, to order above all else. And when order becomes the supreme value, the law itself becomes malleable, right? It can be bent to fit the will of the people in power. And I want to be clear. Every society needs both law and order. Without order, the chaos makes the rights meaningless. Without law, order is just another word for force. But when politicians emphasize order while undermining the law, whether they're stacking the courts with loyalists, whether they're silencing the media, while they're skipping over checks and balances, they tip that balance towards authoritarianism. And that's why history matters here. So the question we have to ask is not just, do we want law and order? Because of course we do. The real question is, whose law and whose order? And who pays the price when that promise is made? I need to take another quick break, but when I come back, we're going to look at the role that inflation, unemployment, and other economic factors can play. I'll be right back. Welcome back. Now, so far, we've seen how law and order has been used in moments of political and social upheaval. But there's another piece of the puzzle: economics. Think about what happens when the economy falters. People lose jobs, the cost of everything rises, families struggle to pay bills, and that kind of instability causes real fear, not just about money, but about the future. And research has shown that when people feel insecure, they become more anxious about crime, even when crime is going down in some cases. The fear is less about actual information and more about just vibes that the world is spinning out of control. And that is the time when law and order promises work. A strong leader who vows to restore stability just feels reassuring. Even if the real problems are economic, the talk shifts the focus from jobs and wages to policing and punishment. And history gives us some clear examples. For example, during the Great Depression, economic collapse opened the door for authoritarian movements. For example, in Germany, the Nazis rose to power in part by capitalizing on economic despair. They promised stability, strength, national renewal, and order was the selling point, even though the legal system was being co-opted to serve a dictator. In the decades after the Soviet Union collapsed, many newly independent states had economic shocks as well. Inflation went up, industry collapsed, ordinary people lost their savings and their security overnight. And in that environment, a great environment of instability and fear, a lot of citizens supported leaders who promised law and order, even at the cost of their democratic freedoms. Political scientists call this the authoritarian resilience, the way that strongmen use order as a substitute for prosperity. And we've seen similar patterns in Latin America, where financial crises often go hand in hand with hardline policies. Leaders present themselves as guarding stability, using militarized policing and harsh punishments to show control. But the deeper economic causes of the unrest just aren't looked at. The situation exists in El Salvador, where there was horrific gang violence, which led to the election of an authoritarian government that, among other things, opened the CICOT prison, where American migrants are being sent. Here's the danger. When citizens feel anxious about their futures, they may accept or even demand stricter enforcement, harsher punishment, and stronger executive power. And leaders who use law and order rhetoric know this, so they tap into that fear of social disorder, but they sidestep the harder work of actually solving the economic problems. And once you make that trade-off, order in exchange for freedom, it's hard to reverse it. So the lesson isn't that safety and security don't matter. They clearly do. Every society needs both. But history shows that when economic anxiety runs high, law and order politics can become a shortcut, a way to offer people the feeling of stability without addressing the root causes. And over time, that shortcut erodes democracy. If we want to understand why law and order rhetoric keeps on returning, even in societies that pride themselves on their democracy, we have to see the economic side because a weak economy causes fear. That's why law and order is so powerful and dangerous. It doesn't just promise safety, it offers certainty in untroubled times. And when people are desperate for certainty, they may not ask enough questions about what they're giving up in order to get it. So, what do we do with this knowledge? First, we have to remember that law and order is not inherently bad. Societies do need both. Without order, rights are fragile. Without law, order is just force, and that balance does matter. But when leaders emphasize order, while they undermine the law to enforce it, when they stretch the courts, when they redraw districts, when they use force against dissent, that's a real warning sign, because it shows that law and order is tipped into something else, authoritarianism. Second, we can train ourselves to ask better questions when we hear the phrase. Whose law? Does it apply equally to everyone, or is it bent to protect the powerful? Whose order? Is it the peace of shared stability, or is it the quiet that comes from silencing your critics? And who benefits? Does this promise serve the public, or does it consolidate authority in the hands of a few? We can resist this shortcut. History shows that when people feel economically or socially insecure, they're most likely to accept harsh measures. It takes focusing on the real causes of the instability, though, inequality, insecurity, corruption, rather than finding and punishing scapegoats. And that means valuing dissent as patriotic, not as a threat to be crushed. The rule of law, properly understood, protects us from power, even when that power claims to speak for order, and we want order. So next time you hear law and order, stop for a second. Ask what's really being promised here. Is it safety or is it silence? Is it stability or is it submission? Because if history has taught us anything, it's this. Law and order can protect democracy, or it can be the tool that slowly dismantles it. The difference lies in whether the law is real and whether the order is just. Have a great week, truth seekers, and stay sharp. Thanks for getting UnSpun with me this week. UnSpun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at theunspunpodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at theunspunpodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception, Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.
Our democracy is hanging by a thread, but we know it's not about just winning and losing each battle. It's about persistence and building resilience.
That's why we're launching the Practivist Pod, the practice of activism made practical.
If you're looking for ways to get engaged or just for ways to stay sane, we want to help you navigate what comes next.
It's an exciting collaboration with political dynamo Jess Craven, author of the Chop Wood, Carry Water newsletter,
and grassroots activist Steve Pearson, host of the How We Win podcast.
Every week on the Practivist Pod, we're going to have important conversations with change makers, give you practical ways to make an impact, have some fun, and inspire hope.
This is more than a podcast. It's a place for our community to grow our practice of advocacy for justice, equity, and progress.
Action is the best antidote for anxiety, so subscribe to the Practivist Pod today.
Tired of sugar-coated news and corporate spin? Check out The Nicole Sandler Show. Speaking truth to power with the irreverence it deserves. Smart, fearless, and just the right amount of snark. Nicole breaks down the headlines, exposes the hypocrisy, and talks with the people working for real change. Weekdays at 3 Eastern, noon Pacific on Progressive Voices, NicoleSandler.com, Substack, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't just get the news, get the truth.